Welcome to Cloud on Air. You are watching Partner Up, a show dedicated to learning more about our trusted partners and discovering how they can help you succeed. My name is Marie.
And I'm Abbas.
And today, we will be talking about opinionated operations with Stackdriver and xMatters. You can ask questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. Let's get started.
Thanks, Marie. So one of the things we're going to be talking about today is really how the world is moving towards an environment where we want to have our operations and support functions operate with best practice and structure more than kind of some of the approaches we've seen historically. And a classic example of really where this came from was during the last, at this point, a decade of us talking about DevOps. So there's a great presentation that you'll find on YouTube if you just search for Google Cloud Platform and search for Seth and Liz talking about the difference between DevOps and SRE. And they kind of talk about like the different functions themselves, but one of the core concepts they talk about as things have matured, this idea of SRE implementing DevOps. This is actually a phrase I probably use at least 2 or 3 times a week, to the point where really I need a t-shirt of it. They mentioned the t-shirt. I've looked and I have not seen this t-shirt, but it's something that really kind of is really important, and it's really in itself a sign that there really now is a mechanism of implementing DevOps at scale for enterprises. So that's really kind of an area that we want to talk about today and how kind of operations and support tools fit together as part of that story. So in this same video, which by the way, I can't help but plug over and over again, it's kind of super important. Really what you'll talk about, what you'll hear things people talk about is everything from organizational structure to blameless postmortems and dealing with failures, implementing changes and kind of reducing the cost of failure, tooling and automation, which is a big part of what we're talking about today, and also measurement. So measurement's a really key part of this as well. We'll talk about how these sorts of tools and components fit together to really create an environment where we're able to pull this off at scale. Now, as with any technology, you'll kind of see, you're probably familiar with this sort of graph talking about hype cycles and things. Now, I'm not going to put DevOps or SRE on this graph because otherwise the YouTube comments will be insane on that sort of stuff. So there's no sense in ever actually putting a dot on it. I will say though, that in general, as things tend to go through a cycle of maturity, you wind up in an environment where you actually do get to the point of, instead of it being a free-for-all and everyone does whatever they want, you get to an environment where you actually have strong opinions, recommendation, best practice, what do you want to call it? You basically wind up in that sort of maturity. Would you agree, Marie?
Yeah, and so that's where you start to get a structure instead of, well, I think this might be a better idea or I think this might be a worse idea. You see patterns emerging on what the industry as a whole agrees are best practices, and that's sort of the point that we think SRE is getting to today.
Right. So there's a couple of key things that you can identify when you actually observe this actually taking place. And one of those that's kind of really interesting is people go from saying things like, oh, we're doing DevOps, or here's an approach to do DevOps, but here's an alternate approach. What does DevOps actually mean? I think we've kind of probably reached peak what is DevOps. I'm kind of tired of that sort of thing, although every year there's still more of it going around. But I think we're really at the point now where people are saying, look, I don't just want to go through and DevOps wash or SRE wash what I'm doing today. I actually agree with the outcomes. I see the benefits. I see where we want to go. And really, people are asking for prescriptive approaches to how they do this, both from organizational structure as well as process and tooling, all those things are kind of increasing demand in the marketplace. And one of the really exciting things we've seen is systems and companies kind of stepping up and saying, look, we've been doing this now for a long time, and instead of being an internal thing or something we talk about at a high level at an event, we're actually going to go through and put some of the solutions to these problems out there. And I think Stackdriver is doing a really nice job of kind of doing that. And that's kind of the first piece of it. There's other things that are kind of really important as far as trends that we observe as well. When people are building these sorts of connecting toolkits together, one of the things I've seen historically a lot of is you wind up thinking about SRE teams as being purely a dev organization for operations. So there's a lot of writing of code, stitching things together. You have your own pipelines for actually maintaining the operations environment itself. And one of the other shifts that we observed that's kind of really interesting has been this maturity to moving towards a low-code, no-code sort of model to stitch all the various components together. So you have the prescriptions of all the various pieces, and then it's not like, well, we're going to have to like spend a bunch of time stitching these components together. You don't have islands of best practice and prescriptions. You actually have an overall complete end-to-end solution. And other trends we've kind of observed are, in terms of having best practice come from different places. Now, obviously, Google is a great place to get information about how to do SRE. I think you guys have been doing it a little bit. There may be some input that you have on that side, but we see this sort of input coming from other places in the marketplace as well. So if you've dealt with major outages or major incidents for your application of service, there probably are other people, in fact, there are for sure, who've been dealing with this in other areas, whether it's crisis management, kind of other incident management practice in other domains and areas. There are approaches and contexts about how to communicate, how to deal with those things that can actually be captured and codified. The other interesting trend we've that we'll be talking about today is how do you actually get better observability of applications in production. So this is one of those classical barriers that's finally starting to break down, which is you have the approach of monitoring in production, and you've got highly observable applications during dev stages, where you can kind of see exactly what's going on. But once it's in prod, even though the theory is you're kind of working in a DevOps sort of mindset, is the granularity and visibility you have in production is very different than what you have in tests. And there's kind of approaches, of course, to deal with that as well.
And this is where Stackdriver's Application Performance Management, or APM suite, can really shine. The debugger tool, for instance, allows you to debug interactively in production without having to stop and restart your app. So it's extremely useful for your production observability.
That's right. It's super exciting when you're kind of able to use the same granularity in one place versus the other. It's amazing whether you're actually looking to optimize a service or when inevitably things go wrong, you actually have visibility of what to actually do. And the other approach that we're seeing is, I think we're moving away from sort of the dogmatic approach of saying it's one way or the other. You have to be fully cloud exclusive versus not. The reality is, if you look at most organizations who have any sort of history, they've gone through different cycles of technology changes. So the average tech cycle at this point, in terms of infrastructure or environment, lasts for what, a couple of years at this point, right? So if you talk to a typical company, they've got some stuff on containers, they've got some stuff that's virtualized, some stuff that's legacy, and lots will even have like mainframe technology. So there's cultural approaches that can apply across all domains. But we have to recognize that all these technical pieces really can't be all migrated all at once, because we would never stop migrating and we'd always never build anything new. So we do kind of have to account for hybrid approaches. And that's something that's really cool about the Stackdriver suite as well, that I think I started hearing about last year for the first time about these sorts of hybrid things.
Yeah, and we're actually working with another partner called Bloom Adora that's dramatically extended our reach in terms of the types of things we can observe. So from on-prem to Azure to AWS to all sorts of other databases and tools, they really give us the ability to pull in signals from those sources and to display them all together in Stackdriver.
So one of the things when we're talking about kind of these opinionated approaches to support, one of the things that you kind of have to deal with when you have any sort of approaches within an operations environment is there are going to be pockets of systems that are already in place, and you can't actually just go wholesale and just replace them. So you kind of have to recognize that there's this concept of authoritative sources that every team has. In fact, I always look at it as any function you look at, from dev to operations to support, any of those organizations, there's going to be a handful of tools that are kind of the home base of those. And when something goes wrong, or you're just rolling something out, you need information in the right places for all those parties for it to be kind of a cohesive organization from an operational standpoint. But that doesn't mean that you're kind of moving bits around manually. So this is kind of where that integration component I talked about earlier is super critical, is putting information in the right places. So this is an example of kind of basically an operational model that I've kind of seen in a number of different enterprises. We find that there's certain anchor tools that we encounter everywhere. It's hard to find an enterprise dev shop that doesn't have JIRA somewhere, right? That's just kind of how it is. It's also very likely that they use something like ServiceNow for incident management. But when you go to the monitoring realm and kind of the infrastructure, log, APM, and managing that sort of work area, there is no shortage of tools, right? So this is just a sampling of some of the ones that I see pretty regularly, things like Splunk or New Relic. You can replace those with Dynatrace, AppDynamics. You can replace Sensu with any myriad of tools. There are literally hundreds of these, and I think a new one is born every couple of hours at this stage. But the important thing that we talk about is moving information into the right system of record where you actually need it, so that the operations and support flows for all these functions are native to the people who are observing them, but you're actually connecting them all together into a cohesive view.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what we really find, especially at larger enterprises, is that different teams have different preferred tools. And instead of viewing that as a bug that has to be fixed, xMatters allows us to view it as functionality that's useful to the teams and that we can assemble into a cohesive whole.
Right. it's kind of funny when you think about it kind of from an initial perspective, it seems like, well, why can't everyone just use my tool, right? And then you kind of wind up with these conversations where if you push that too hard, you'll start hearing phrases like, you'll have to pry that out of my cold dead hands, which I figure is actually generally not a great way to actually move any sort of process forward. So in general, I think a collaborative approach to having information in the right systems, but actually driving for optimal performance of the overall operations workflow, that's kind of the key. And you can do that through integrations. Now that's kind of one example of kind of an operations and support sort of environment. However, this sort of concept of having information in the right places applies at all stages of app dev, right? So whether you're looking at delivery, this example over here where you want to basically make sure information that you're actually publishing back out and actually delivering software, that information in a lot of cases also needs to be made available to your customer support team. Whether if they live in Salesforce, you want them to be aware of tools as well. But if you said to them, hey, it's really important that you actually grab this information out of our Ansible logs, that's kind of unlikely, right? So you want to have information wind up in the right places, and also you want to publish into shared collaboration spaces, whatever you happen to use. That's going to be the right place for it to wind up. Or if you're choosing a cloud-native operation stack where you want to have everything coming through Prometheus, and you're just want to have a ton of time series sort of data, you can combine that in there and combine it with automation tasks. But the key again is the information goes where the teams need it to be. And the other component that's super important as part of this is the more tooling you have, the more data you have at your disposal, right? So you mentioned you can have a lot of information from agents going into Stackdriver. Now, when someone is actually in firefighting mode, there's a ton of stuff to sift through. So one thing that's kind of really interesting that we're starting to see more of is moving away from the context alert into a high context alert. And this is where things like Stackdriver APM and stuff are really cool, is when something goes wrong, it's context linked to everything in place as well.
Exactly. And this is an area where Stackdriver has some exciting new products that are coming out that I can't quite talk about yet.
Right. Well, we'll save that little sneak preview for another time to come back and fulfill that promise. When we talk about like essentially a constellation of opinionated operations tools, this is an example of one. So if you're looking at your particular perspective, you might say, look, I have all my information being kind of aggregated within Stackdriver, and that really represents the system that's going to tell me that something is going on. But beyond that, there are other parties and other teams, and you'll see it kind of highlighted here in this graphic, who have different perspectives on it. You might have a team that needs to make sure status page has the latest information so that customers are aware of any ongoing operational issues. If it's an issue that a dev team needs to work on, that work needs to be tracked. There's task management involved there, and that in this example is JIRA. And when all those teams need to kind of work together to say, hey, what are we doing on this thing? You kind of wind up in Slack to kind of collaborate together. And really one of the things that we talk about within the xMatters product framework is having these sort of operations flows that drive this sort of behavior in here. And what we want to do is actually walk through a quick example of a life cycle of one of these sorts of things. So it's not just kind of the animation, which is now slowly starting to hypnotize me.
Let's move off this slide.
Great. So this is an example of kind of if you're a Stackdriver user, this is a familiar screen. It's kind of in your alerting framework. Whatever components of Stackdriver you have rolled out, whatever the source is, when something actually goes sideways, it's going to wind up here, right? And really what we want to walk through is the life cycle of how this actually progresses through the system. So in a typical setup for any xMatters customer, anyone who's really kind of consuming this data, you want it to wind up in the right person's hands. These are kind of capturing this data from Stackdriver and going to a mobile device. You essentially have this information captured along and being delivered to someone who's on call. And I'll talk shortly about how you actually know who that person is. But you want to arm them with a highly opinionated view of what they do next. So one of the tricks with kind of running an effective operations environment is making sure you don't forget steps. So that's kind of a common issue, which is you see an alert. So I have this tendency, right? I see a problem and I'm like, forget everything else. Let's go fix that problem. But if the people who need to know that there's a problem taking place aren't able to act on it, then I've actually failed in my goal. I may solve the problem, but I'm going to create unhappy customers in my pathway to getting there. So one of the things we talk about is having your practice that's kind of that you see everyone benefit from captured directly in your communication. So in this case, you're highlighting that acknowledgement needs to happen first, or you need to escalate, and there's other sorts of activities that can take place. If you expect you need a dev team's help, then basically go through and create a JIRA issue so it's tracked there. If you know it's an incident that customers might need to be aware of, create that ServiceNow incident so your incident management team can kick in from there as well. It's customers who need to be aware of it right now. The right person can raise the flag here as well, or of course post a collaboration in Slack. this actually is an interesting place for us to talk about some new stuff that the Stackdriver team's working on to actually add new sorts of options to this type of list.
Yeah, so coming soon, one of the options you'll see in this list is to create an incident in Stackdriver's incident response and management tool, which is sort of a distillation of our years, if not decades, of SRE experience into a tool for Google Cloud customers and for other customers to use. And the goal of IRM is to give you an opinionated framework, once again, believing that SRE has coalesced to the point where opinions are relevant and we want to have a structured way of approaching our incidents. And to take that framework and to give it to our customers so that as they have an incident, they make sure that they don't skip any of the steps like Abbas was just talking about, and they're able to do their follow-up and have all of their information consolidated and see everything in the same place. So it's essentially a new tool that you haven't really seen before that would fit in this list of areas where you can take an action.
So I'm super excited about this particular release because we all kind of read the SRE books and the SRE guide, and it's super interesting to hear about. This is the best way to actually work through a cycle.
Yep.
But historically, it was like, great, I'm going to read the book. Now I'm going to go to my incident management tool of choice, and I'm somehow actually going to code this thing in here so I can actually capture it in the tool. So it was very much like there was an opinion. However, there was no tool with the opinion. So I'm actually super excited to see IRM kind of come out and actually capture that sort of stuff in there. And I think in particular for SRE teams who have to today kind of settle for going to a dev, it's kind of a dev-oriented approach with JIRA or incident management with ServiceNow and try to basically modify those to suit their needs, which are kind of lightweight, quick, connected to other systems, or now they'll actually have a real opinionated alternative within IRM. So I'm super excited to actually see this launch.
Yep.
So continuing on kind of from our cycle, I mentioned I'd come back to this, but just kind of an important piece when you're talking about really having an SRE function scale out. SRE functions really are very dependent on lots of other teams when things go outside their immediate scope. So if it's not something that they're aware of or dealt with or have kind of a process to deal with, they quickly need to go and engage other teams. And those teams may be particular escalations into dev teams, they may be infrastructure teams, partner teams. We're talking larger enterprises, maybe entirely other organizations, managed service providers. Lots of people need to engage within that framework. And that's one of the things we've built a great deal of information into xMatters, is to be aware of group structure, organizational dynamics, the temporal nature of things. So if you're a global company, you've got to deal with shifts and all sorts of handoffs and things like that. We capture all that information, so it's just integrated as part of the workflow. So when you actually get a message from xMatters, it's already passed through many context filters before that message gets to the right person, and then you arm them with the actions that we just talked about before as well. Then contextually, one of the other things that's kind of a little subtle piece in there, I'll kind of flip back just for a second, is you'll notice kind of simple buttons on there. Create an issue, create a ticket, post up a status page, post something to Slack. All those things kind of have a little bit of a catch in there. It's a little bit buried in here. And this goes back to one of our points earlier about low code and no code sorts of approaches, which is you actually want to make this look deceptively easy, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of happening in there. So if you think about just translating an infrastructure-oriented alert into a workflow-oriented task, there is field level mapping, there's prioritization, there's enrichment, there's grabbing service descriptions, team assignment sort of concepts. All those pieces need to kind of somehow happen, and those are all kind of captured within the xMatters system as well. So within kind of an opinionated operations approach, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing is masking that complexity away. So you're able to just grab a shared library and say, yep, this workflow says create things in ServiceNow, or create things in JIRA, or post it to Slack, or go through and grab more details from our code management repository. You're able to go through and just grab all these components together and essentially assemble the flow that it takes to serve your operational need. So that's kind of some of the secret sauce behind the scenes. And the end point of this is whatever the destination is of that information, it just kind of shows up there. And you kind of take it for granted that it's kind of showed up and it's gone through all those context translations. And from that point on, if that particular system is also tied to xMatters, the next piece is another piece of opinionated workflow for that organization. So it's kind of like you're stringing together a bunch of pieces together all the time to serve the operations function from different context viewpoints. So in this example, this would be more for someone who is a ServiceNow-oriented incident manager. Their viewpoint is different. They may say, look, I'm not going to hop into a Slack channel to resolve this issue. I actually need to assemble the heads of various business units and customer-facing teams into a conference call. That's a different stage of collaboration that they may need maybe not be useful for the SRE team, but maybe for this one. So that's kind of reflected in this sort of structure, but they're also able to connect back into shared pieces of information like a status page if they need to as well. So all these pieces kind of stitch together to create the overall story. And that hopefully gives you a little bit of a sense of how all these pieces fit together. Check down at the bottom, you'll see a couple of links on there for some videos if you'd like to dive into any of these areas in more detail. With that, I think we just want to be sensitive a little bit to not taking up too much time, because there is kind of a max time for a video between like kind of a snack time. Is it a lunch video? Is it like a afternoon break video? So I think we're approaching that sort of time frame. So why don't we share some parting thoughts with everyone, Marie?
Yeah, so as we talked about at the beginning, SRE has moved to a point where informed opinions are starting to come to the forefront and sort of dominate over free-form options where I have one idea and you have a different one. We've now all sort of agreed that there's an approach that makes sense. And part of that approach is automating and integrating wherever it's possible, so you aren't doing the same work over and over. And if Abbas and I are doing the same work at different companies, we can work together, automate it, and then neither of us has to do it
Well,
again.
I don't know if we can work together. That's going too far. Because I have very strong opinions, and I want to be
I
totally
know,
free
yeah,
flow.
you just want to use JIRA. The one thing that ops teams are starting to notice is they have an ever-growing code base, and we're trying to minimize that and to outsource as much of it as possible, because when you own code, it gets old, it breaks. You really want someone else to be responsible for maintaining it. Testing in prod, it's really the best thing to do. It is closest to your real world because it is your real world, but it's really hard and it's scary. And so we want to give you as many tools as we can that make it less scary, less hard, and help you identify and resolve issues as quickly as possible. And lastly, we know that cloud is important. I work for Google Cloud. But we know that it's also not the only place you may be running your workloads, and we want to cover all of those places where you're running the workloads. And so xMatters and our other partners help us to make sure that we're able to meet all of your observability needs.
Great, thank you, Marie. So I think that kind of wraps things up pretty well, right? I think one of the things, like I said, I'm super excited about is seeing these sorts of development of these tools. And I actually can't wait to see some of these things come out, more and more things come out from the SRE learnings, because frankly, it's kind of a little crazy when we go through and say, hey, this is the best way to do it, but we don't give people the tools, right? So I actually think if there's one thing I would say is the next edition of the guidebook should actually have specific things on here saying, this is the tool you should use. Forget everything else, don't do any other way. It's like right on, like a full-on recipe book to actually support a transformation of companies who are actually going through these journeys, so they don't have to go through and trip over the same pitfalls as other people may have. So we actually want to have good footprints to follow in.
Yep, and in a couple years, I think that's where Stackdriver will be. So
we'll
looking forward to that. Thank you for tuning in to Partner Up. Please visit Cloud OnAir to discover more content from Google Cloud experts.